Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, joining us, as always, from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, I think it's getting kind of repetitive for us to kind of say it's been another dramatic week. But here we are in this era where every day brings us new things that maybe we imagined could be possible at some point, but we just never imagined it would happen so fast after the previous thing that we thought was unimaginable, and then the previous thing before that we thought was unimaginable. We are really having to rethink so much of what we've taken for granted in the international order. Now, maybe that's coming from someone like me, who is obviously from the United States and who is accustomed to many of the institutions that are proving to be far more vulnerable than I think a lot of us expected. But when you and I were talking, coming from a perspective in South Africa, where I think you've seen firsthand the fragility of institutions, you're not as surprised by the dismantling of United States Institute of Peace, the Wilson Center, any number of aid agencies like USAID. Now we have the end of U.S. government-funded broadcasting, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Radio Marti, the Voice of America. All of it now is basically stopped and curtailed. Not something that I had on my bingo card, but here we are. But you weren't quite as surprised as I was.
Well, maybe I should kind of add a little bit of context. When I said I wasn't, what I was less surprised by was the process of loyalists, of political loyalists being kind of added into the machinery of U.S. institutions, right? Because that is something that South Africa lived through during the Zuma era. So South African institutions were modeled on U.S. institutions, a lot of them, and they were modeled to be resilient and transparent and so on. And then they were slowly kind of taken over by loyalists. So that's what I mean. I'm still quite surprised, I have to say, by the dismantling of the machinery as a whole. That's a step further than I had expected. It's quite something to actually see it in action.
Yeah, this is the dismantling, I think, is the word to describe here. It's the dismantling of many parts of the regulatory state in the United States. It's also dismantling of many of the institutions that the United States has used for almost 75 years now to maintain its hegemonic role atop the liberal international order. An order, by the way, that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who said in his testimony when he was being confirmed, no longer serves the United States. And it looks like the Trump administration is following through with that commitment to reestablish themselves in the international order. Let's get some perspective on this. And Cobus, today I'm going to try and change your role so that you're not only a questioner and a co-host today, but I'd also like you to be a guest. And I'd like you to join our old friend, Gyude Moore, who's, for longtime listeners of the show, will know that he's a regular with us, and we're thrilled to have him back. By the way, Gyude has some different affiliations that I want to let everybody know about. He's now a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., and also an inaugural fellow at the Global Neighbours. And of course, previously, in a previous life, he was the Public Works Minister of Liberia, and he joins us at an absurdly early hour today from Phoenix, Arizona. A very, very early morning. Good morning to you, Gyude. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Cobus. It's always a pleasure being here with you guys discussing these issues, so thanks for having me again.
It is. I am so excited to have you. I've been wanting to talk to you. You've been writing a lot on this new emerging post-American order. Before we get into that, though, I just want to, I don't think a lot of people are going to be familiar with Global Neighbours. In 2 seconds, can you just tell us a little bit about Global Neighbours and what you're doing there?
Absolutely. So Global Neighbours is a new think tank. It's in Vienna, Austria. It was created by the German investor, her name is Jovanka Porsche. And this idea was she spent a significant portion of her career in Asia. And when she returned to Europe, she understood that the conversation about Asia didn't reflect the reality that she lived in Asia. And so Global Neighbours was this idea of sort of creating this a bridge between Europe and Asia and the world beyond, and sort of bringing Asia to the rest of the world, but then understanding. And then one of the programs they have is to have a visiting fellow, and I was the inaugural one. So even though it's Europe, Asia, and the world beyond, the first visiting fellow happens to be an African. And so in that role, I focused on not just the relationship between Asia and Africa, especially between China and Africa, but Europe's role as Africa's closest neighbor. What that means in this new age. And so I spent 6 weeks in Vienna, and I'm back in the US now. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. And I also want to let everybody know that you've been spending a lot of time out here in Asia. You've been teaching at the Schwarzman program in Beijing at Tsinghua University. So we want you to bring some of those reflections in on kind of your new exposure to China, and particularly at this moment of history. So let's just start with a few things. I'm just going to put a bunch of things on the table, and I want you guys to kind of hash it out so we can kind of benefit from your insights and expertise. Right now, at the time of this recording, Ibrahim Rasul is now out of the United States. He was given 72 hours to leave Washington, D.C. as the former South African ambassador to the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called Rasul a race-baiting politician who hates America and President Trump. Now, the expulsion came after Rasul accused Mr. Trump in a recent webinar of pursuing policies and practices that he characterized as, and I'm going to quote here, a white supremacist response to growing demographic diversity in the United States. Cobus, this is your country's envoy to the United States. Rasul was a controversial choice even before he arrived. Joshua Meservey at the Hudson Institute posted a bunch of posts on X saying, listen, this is not a good person to send as an envoy if you want to repair relations between South Africa and the United States. So this is not a huge surprise that the Trump administration responded this way. I guess it is a surprise in one sense, though, for how they did it and how it was framed. Let's get your reaction, Cobus, first to that. And again, we're going to bring this all back to China, later on. So let's first talk about the Rasul expulsion. And Gyude, I'd like to get your take on this as well. Cobus, go.
About Ibrahim Rasul himself, I think he's one of South Africa's, like, what really kind of a heavyweight in South Africa. So in the sense of simply choosing what I think the government thought was one of their most kind of solid officials, like that, he certainly brings seniority to the table. So, he has been, he's echoed the South African stance on the crisis in Gaza. And my suspicion is that probably, painted a target on him, in addition to him simply being the South African ambassador. I think he wasn't, as far as I understand, and this is based on reading a transcript from the comments. It wasn't so much that he was like kind of calling out the U.S. or Donald Trump specifically, President Trump specifically, as being this like massive white supremacist. I think he was making the point that this is a larger kind of like Republican counter movement against growing multiculturalism, right? Which is something I think a lot of Republicans would say themselves, right? Kind of like this is why else go after DEI programs if you're not interested, if you want to move away from multiculturalism. So in that sense, like I can see in the context of the fight with South Africa why they went in this direction, but it was a gestural move. It wasn't that they were somehow kind of catching him out on like egregious hate speech, in a hidden like dark room. This was a public webinar. He was saying things that I think would be controversial maybe in MAGA world, but it wasn't off the charts nuts, right? So in that sense, like I think it is much more revealing, I think, of just how what a bad place a relationship is, than particularly I think any huge misstep from his side. Although I think definitely both him and South Africa could have been more careful in terms of talking. But what's interesting is that in the same speech, he made the point that countries tend to look through two lenses at international relations, one being a values lens and the other being an interest lens. And he was actually in the speech calling for South Africa to move away from a values lens towards an interest lens, and that ended up being truer, I think, than he suspected.
Gyude, what's your take? How do you frame this?
So I think there is a pattern here. And the South African and Rasul just basically didn't fall in line with that pattern. If you look at the conversation with President Zelensky was meant to not push back against President Trump in that meeting. He just followed sort of the pattern of behavior that we saw, say, from the UK Prime Minister, who came with a letter from the King and sort of give President Trump the attention he deserves, give President Trump the sort of adoration and making him the center of attention that he deserves. And because U.S. relations with South Africa has been on the rocks for a while, especially since this Gaza issue, the expectation, at least from the Trump administration, that South Africa would have sent a more conciliatory choice. But to Cobus's point, Rasul is one of the most decorated South African diplomats, very, very experienced in coming to this role, having served here before. But it was just not the time. The administration doesn't it doesn't allow for much disagreement with anyone. I mean, there is now no distinction between foe and friend with the U.S. government. So a South Africa that is already in a relationship on the rocks, sending an ambassador like this, and his comment that Cobus said isn't as crazy as they made it to sound like. It is this idea that there is a counter movement to what we saw after the George Floyd's death. There was this huge move towards, multiculturalism, acknowledging minority slights and structural issues against minority rights in the society. And after a while, there was a counter movement against that. And what we're seeing now is an extension of that. And I think that's what he meant. But it goes to show what relationships are like now with the United States. It's kind of difficult to have an independent opinion. It's difficult to disagree with the government because the United States is no longer seeing itself in the role that it was, say, a year ago. Right. And so we're in a completely different time now, so far as the United States is concerned.
Well, Cobus, one of your former colleagues at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo de Carvalho, who we have had on the program before, he's one of the foremost experts on the BRICS. He wrote a lengthy, passionate analysis of the Rasul expulsion, and I'd like to get both of your take on this. He said, quote, "It would be easy to dismiss Rasul's expulsion as another tense moment in U.S.-South Africa relations, but the real issue is precedent. No global South country can be allowed to successfully use international law against a U.S. ally, especially being one of the few left. This isn't about Pretoria. It's about who might be next." What do you think of that, Cobus?
I tend to think that Gustavo has a point, and that it probably on the Republican side it is, it will be framed in terms of the U.S. put blood and treasure into supporting this global international order, and now it's being turned against it and its friends, right? That is roughly the argument. I think that frequently comes out. I think the part of what I think this highlights is the kind of impossibility of the situation in a way, because the thing is, the situation, the crisis in Gaza, it's not only that the crisis in Gaza doesn't go away. It's like the crisis in Gaza, it's like this is kind of like mountain. Like, I live in Cape Town, right? Kind of like everywhere you go, you have to navigate around the mountain. Like now, that has taken on that kind of reality, in the sense that it changed the landscape of international law, whatever the US's role was in it. And in a way, there was nothing. Seeing, like taking on, if you take into account South Africa's history, there was no other real way for South Africa to react, and still be true to its kind of post-apartheid, like, guiding principles. And in some kind of ways, that put it on this collision course with the US, because obviously, kind of Israeli issues are like occupy a special position in US politics. So, so in that sense, like there's a kind of an inevitability to it, which, which makes it so tragic. I think that no one chose to find a guardrail off, kind of that would be sustainable.
But just to give South Africa's critics fair due, they would say that you didn't respond, not you, but the South African government didn't do the same to Russia and its unlawful invasion of Ukraine,
it's
for
true.
example.
And
and there's some hypocrisy. It seems very selective of the South Africans to do Gaza, and then for you to say we had no other choice, when in fact you did have a choice. You didn't have to do this. No, I'm just being devil's advocate here, but I think that's what the critics would contend.
Yes, but that would be a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. Like South Africa isn't kind of morally bound to respond to every form of injustice, right? That it's a small country. It doesn't have time in the world for that. It's forced to respond to moments where it has particular expertise and experience. Okay. And and in the case of, and not to get into Israel issues, because there's no time for that. But there are certain kind of structural realities in Israel that are very similar to South Africa, and Israel itself had a long-term there was a co-authorship kind of process, kind of from 1948 to the end of apartheid, that happened between Israel and South Africa, which is well documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the South Africans are involved in a way that other countries are not. And they are involved in a way that they're not involved in, say, the junta in Myanmar or the invasion in Ukraine. So that's why, like, there's a particular kind of historical connection that is specific to South Africa around these issues. But, should South Africa has been performatively kind of criticizing Putin? Absolutely. Like, that would have been the smart thing to do, right? South Africa can be very, very dumb in terms of like how it kind of navigates in some of these issues. And I think this was probably an example of that. But at the same time, at the core of this issue, it really reaches to the heart of what post-apartheid South Africa is.
Gyude, when we talk about the lessons that either Gustavo's talking about or that Cobus is talking about, let's bring China into this picture now. What do you think African policymakers in places like Pretoria, in your home country, in Liberia, are thinking in terms of their relations with the United States as it relates to potentially leaning more on non-U.S. powers like China? How does this play out in the foreign ministries and in the presidential offices across the continent?
Well, first, I want to respond to Gustavo's point that I think you look at what happened with Colombia, look at what happened with Panama, and then you put South Africa within that. I think this is also about a message that you're sending to the rest of the world. It is a message that you're sending about the international system. The American Vice President J.D. Vance said this in his speech to the Europeans at the Munich Security Conference. There is a new sheriff in town. He said that to Europeans. And I think that's a big part of that message, that the United States you knew under Joe Biden and before is no longer here. This is a completely new thing. The way the international system works now is going to be different. American interests first and above everything else. It's not about building international institutions. It's not about building international systems or defending them. It is every single action that the United States takes will be seen in the lens of how does this advance American interests, and American interests defined really narrowly. And so now for African governments and elsewhere, I think there were signs of this under the first Trump administration. In terms of in private, how the president supposedly spoke of the continent. And but also
that's the famous S-holes comment.
That's correct.
Describing,
But also his former Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, wrote a book in which he said that the president wanted to shut down every embassy on the continent, but was told it would be to China's advantage. and that's why he didn't. So
And he wanted to shut down AFRICOM as well.
that's correct, and I think that's going to go forward now. But I think from his campaign, Africa has just never ranked really high on President Trump's personal priority list. I think for most American politicians who end up being president of the United States, the continent isn't as important. Now, President Biden went out of his way. President Obama tried to do something there, but Africa hasn't really ranked high. But now it is more stark in terms of how unimportant this relationship is to the United States. And I think insofar as China is concerned, first, it means that China increasingly becomes the only game in town, right? Because once USAID, part of the thing was that USAID was a significant contributor to human capital issues on the continent, health, education, building health systems and stuff, while the Chinese sort of focused on hard infrastructure. So it was like each partner had their competency. But now with the United States completely withdrawing from USAID, then the only major player on the continent now becomes China. And of course, the Europeans are there.
I was about to say the Europeans would probably say they're still a major player.
They're there, but it was much bigger between China and the United States than, say, Europe. But without discounting European presence too. My fear, though, is that this point that I made previously, that insofar as Africa is concerned, the continent isn't seeking a partner of choice. So that on every issue the continent wants to resolve, it goes to a single partner. It is seeking a choice of partners. You want to have as many partners as possible because Africa's needs and demands are so multifaceted, it's impossible for a single actor to be able to meet all of them. But more importantly, one doesn't want to be dangerously dependent on a single actor. And that's where you find yourself if China remains the dominant game in town for almost everything that you're trying to do, the only partnership you have. And so part of the argument I made with global neighbors across Europe was that this shouldn't be, that Europe is much closer to Africa, that there is a possibility, there is a future scenario in which an Afro-European economy matches the growth that we're seeing in Asia. But Europe must first change the lenses through which it views Africa instead of seeing the continent as a source of problems, but as a source of opportunities. Europe is an aging continent. Africa is a very young one. The African youth and the consumption of African youth and its labor force can match for European capital and create abundance for both Europe and Africa.
But that doesn't align with the politics of the moment in Europe today. Marine Le Pen in France, AfD in Germany, the Democrats in Sweden. They don't want you.
No question.
In any context.
But this is 100% correct. And I made this point in Budapest, of all places. Okay? So in Budapest, I said to my audience in Budapest that, look, the median age in your country is 44 years old. It means 50% of your population is over 44. Right? Number two, most young people from Hungary seek opportunities elsewhere in Western Europe. But Budapest has been, Hungary has been on the forefront of this, no migration, and there is inexorable. The demographics, the direction of demographics, at some points, Europe can do everything the thing that it wants to do at this point. But at some point, it's going to be inevitable that you're going to need migrants in your countries. Rather, it's important to have the conversation when you have control over it than not in the future. But the point I'm trying to make is that the America's withdrawal from the international system simply means that the international system depends more and more on China. And it is a better international system when when it's not a single actor on which all of the system depends. Right? It was good as long as the United States was dominant, that China was a rising power. The way I describe it in my Global Neighbors piece is that the stability of the stool depends on three legs, right? You have a Europe, you have a China, you have a United States, and in the future, maybe an India. The more we create the legs on which the stool stands, the more stable the system is. And now, with the American withdrawal, but not simply withdrawing, but basically undermining the institutions it spent so much building, and institutions that have delivered significant value to the United States.
Gyude, like obviously you were the public works minister in Liberia, so I think you maybe have a closer view of what the actual role of USAID was, and so can you give us like a glimpse of what you think the effects have been or will be of the sudden withdrawal?
I think one of the issues you have to look at is that a lot of African countries invest very little in their health and education systems to such an extent that more and more of health spending is incredible that South Africa, the continent's most complex economy, and for why its wealthiest economy, there's still 500 million or 400 to 500 million a year from PEPFAR providing antiretroviral drugs for South African citizens. It seems incredible that even up to today, that was still an issue in South Africa. Same thing in Nigeria. Same thing in Tanzania, right? The Americans have increasingly taken a bigger and bigger role when it comes to building health systems. But I was in Liberia when Ebola struck. And part of the reason was because the health system wasn't resilient. We have very little in terms of disease surveillance. So at the end of that crisis, the US government through USAID helped us build what is called the National Public Health Institute of Liberia with extensive surveillance capabilities now, so that the emergence of new pathogens are easily spotted and we can be able to counter that. And you said it wasn't just in Liberia, in other places in the world. So USAID had an outsized role when it came to supporting health and health systems, making health systems more resilient. And so I think over time, yes, African governments are going to find the money somewhere to close the gap, but we will measure USAID's withdrawal in lives lost. Because there is going to be a dislocation period before you can close the gap. And in that period, I think a significant amount of lives will be lost.
But I seem to recall that after the announcement of the USAID freeze, Secretary of State Rubio did say that PEPFAR funding was restarted again, wasn't it? Isn't that the case?
But everyone, the thing was, there were waivers supposedly issued, but there was no one to work through those waivers. You
Right.
fired
The staff's
everybody.
been
So how you
dismissed. Yeah.
and you completely broken the entire system, and somehow you said that the system was going to continue
It's
to
back
work. That's
again.
not. Yeah, that's not true. So
Well,
I think but again, it was always an American prerogative, right? That whether they wanted to continue to provide assistance or not. But I think there was an orderly way to do it, and then there was a gratuitously
yeah.
cruel way to do it. And I think they chose the latter.
And the United States withdrawal from USAID also resulted in a $115 million cut for the Africa Centers for Disease Control. China, together with South Korea, contributed $4 million to help make up that gap. But there's still a huge gap in terms of disease surveillance and infectious surveillance, as you've talked about. Let's talk about China, because the reaction online to this emotional reaction that is in a lot of our YouTube comments on this topic is, F the Americans, South Africa and Africa can lean into the BRICS, China can be our partner. I think that's an emotional issue, an emotional response. It's not rooted in, the BRICS is nothing to lean into. There is nothing there. It is not there's no trade mechanism. It's a grouping. It's a conversational forum. It's an important forum, to be sure, but there is no immediate benefit from the BRICS that's going to fill the gaps left by the United States or turning away from the West. As for China, people will say it's the continent's largest trading partner, but when you look at the numbers, that trade is highly distorted, heavily concentrated in resource exporting countries for African exports to China, and also heavily concentrated in large populous countries for Chinese imports to Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, dominating the import side of it. The rest of the continent has a pretty weak trade relationship with Africa, Liberia being an example. Not a very robust trade relationship between Liberia and China. This is just an example. And so China is not going to be the solution to the problem here. It's going to be maybe part of it. But when we look at the role that China can play, they're not going to fill the void left by USAID. Again, they're going to potentially keep Africa locked at the bottom of the value chain, in part because the China price is extraordinarily competitive, right? Who's going to beat the China price? Either because of Chinese incredible competence at producing goods cheaper than everybody else, or because of heavily subsidized industries like resource processing and mineral processing. Gyude, kind of talk to us about this complex relationship that African countries have today with China and what role it plays going forward in this new world that we're in, the post-American world, as you've talked about in your Global Neighbors posts.
Yeah, I think first is I think with Africa it will come. I think with other emerging economies is already here. I'm thinking Indonesia, South Africa, Colombia, Mexico, and basically what we have is um, UNIDO has a report out on industrialization. It's been out for a bit now, and one of the arguments to make in that piece is that outside of countries that had significant natural resources, say like the Gulf states, or say, hey, so Norway, right? The only path from low income status to higher income status has been through manufacturing. That more than 80% of all the patents issued globally have come through manufacturing process. That for every manufacturing job, there are two other jobs that are supported by a single manufacturing job. And so for every single country that's looking on the structural adjustment path, wanting to leave low income status to even middle income status, you need manufacturing. But what we've seen though is an insane concentration of manufacturing in a single country, in China. In fact, UNIDO now projects that by 2030, in 5 years, 45% of global manufacturing output will be in a single country. The last time we saw any dominance of this kind was the United States after World War II, because industrial capacity had been destroyed in Europe and in Japan. But we've seen the accumulation of that space, of that dominance by China in peacetime. And so increasingly, what's going to happen is that trade with China in finished goods is going to be one way. China is selling you finished goods, and you're selling China on processed.
But that's the way it is now, for the most part.
But it's going to become even worse than that. And so what needs to happen, of course, is that other countries, you want to sell things that are more valuable to China. And so I think if you saw the outcomes of the two sessions, I think the Chinese themselves recognize this, because a big outcome of the two sessions was to increase domestic consumption so that China itself now becomes the market. And I believe that up to 2018, China was on the path for that, because in 2018, China was the largest luxury goods market in the world. But a combination of COVID and the collapse of the real estate sector in China, and then a decline in consumer sentiment means that most people in China are not spending anymore, meaning that the Chinese themselves have become almost dangerously dependent on export markets. 1 trillion in export surplus. In the short term, it looks like an advantage, but in the long term, it means that there's so little growth from domestic consumption that you have to depend overwhelmingly on export markets. So I think we're already seeing that in Colombia, for example, they imposed a 35% tariff on Chinese steel imports, simply because without doing that, the Colombian steel industry would have collapsed. We're seeing the same thing.
And that's happened in Vietnam and India. Several countries have also
in
put
Chile,
tariffs
in
on.
Mexico, in Brazil, we're seeing that happen. In Indonesia and in South Africa, they're putting tariffs on the textiles like Temu and Shein, because it is undermining local textiles industries. And so China is this complex relationship. It is our largest trade partner. It is our largest bilateral creditor, right? And outside of, so the EU 27 as a unit remains the continent's largest trade partner, but China as a single country is still our largest trade partner as an individual. So most African exports are going to China, but it's raw materials and unprocessed raw materials that's going to China. So I think, to your point, that in this world going forward, that it is not as straightforward as China just immediately replacing the United States. That for every country, for Kenya, for Morocco, for South Africa that's looking to move, or even Liberia to move higher and higher up the value chain, you are going to encounter a Chinese variant of whatever it is you're producing that is probably of higher quality and significantly cheaper than what you're trying to do. So the way out for us, I think, is the AFCFTA.
I was just about to say, I'm glad you brought that up, that the bigger problem is the fact that it's easier to trade with China than it is for Liberia to trade with South Africa. I mean, Cobus, Africa goes nowhere without doing more trade among its own states.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think that there's an interesting question to be had there about what would, in addition to all of the work that the AFCFTA has been trying to do around integrating markets and like cross-border logistics and so on. There's an interesting, I think, discussion to be had about whether the only two options are, or whether the only option is importing finished goods from China, right? Because we're already seeing more assembly of Chinese stuff in Africa. There was a mobile phone assembly thing launched in Kenya a while ago.
In Zambia too. But a lot of that assembly, let's be careful. A lot of that assembly was literally inserting batteries into phone and then kind of putting on the back. It's very minimal assembly, but they needed to qualify for a made in Zambia type of designation.
True, but that gives you an early clue of what a kind of a hybrid trade relationship with China could look like, right? Kind of because you can import 1 billion different components to a place like South Africa, which has some manufacturing capacity, and then if you look at MTN, right? Kind of MTN, the South African telecoms company, they sell transient phones up and down the continent, right? They don't make their own phones. They don't make MTN phones. They, but they are already a distribution network that could, if linked to an assembly plant in South Africa, could be selling quote unquote half, like 50% made in South Africa kind of products, right? Via a Chinese kind of like parts creation, kind of sector ecosystem. Which at the moment, now that we're in tariff world, kind of with the Trumps, I think increasingly we are also going to see the emergence of tariff world and non-tariff world, right? So there's going to be non-tariff relationships. And increasingly, one of the non-tariff relationships that probably makes sense is for countries with low manufacturing capacity to import highly discounted manufactured stuff from China, particularly ones that are strategic for specific industries, like say solar panels, right? So if you're a country like Malawi, there's a certain kind of logic to be made where you can say, well, at the very least, everything's going to hell, but at the very least, we can now get solar panels cheaper than we could probably ever expect to get them. So let's get them while we can, and then let's build some kind of domestic development of that electrification. So there is a certain logics there, I think, where you start disaggregating the different factors, but I think a lot of it depends on African countries getting it together and really implementing the AFCFTA.
Without question.
Let's use that as a jumping off.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about. Go
I was just about to say, let's get a jumping off point from that, Gyude, about how would you advise presidents and prime ministers on the continent based on what Cobus has said in terms of how to best take advantage of the relationship with China and Chinese manufacturing?
I think your best bet is to look at China's own history. I'm reading a book down of about 1,000 Days in Shanghai of the guy who led the Volkswagen sort of partnership with China. And since 1978, during the opening, one of the things the Chinese have been very, very unfocused on was developing. So when they partnered with Volkswagen, the plan was also to develop all of the supply chains in China. And come now to this modern age to be the same thing with Tesla. That when the Tesla factory opened, at least 50% of the components had to be sourced domestically. Now it's over 85%. The Teslas that are manufactured at the Gigafactory in Shanghai are 100% Chinese cars, right? So one of the things they did, though, with every car company in the world was that in exchange for access to the market, you had to have a Chinese partner, and it had to be 50%. So I don't think every single African country is in a position to do that. But there are some African countries, like the big markets that Chinese manufacturers want to access, is that first, if we have an external tariff wall with the AFCFTA, then it means that to have access to the market, you actually build a factory within the continent. And then if we add that you're not just building a Chinese factory in South Africa or in Nigeria, but it's a Chinese factory with, say, 25% local partnership with a local company, in the hope that we continue to move up, just the exact same playbook that the Chinese themselves play. However, the reason China could use that trade playbook is because it was a massive market with a single jurisdiction. Now we have a possible massive market, but with 54 separate jurisdictions. which makes no sense. We spoke to BDI, which is sort of the German industrial, all of German industry is sort of the industry group. And they said that for their members, you know, a Burundi by itself, Central African Republic by itself, Liberia by itself, that there's no
Doesn't
real
make sense.
attraction there. But if
That's right.
all of this is a single market, then the investment makes sense. But in a piece that I wrote is that the cost of coordination is simply significant, right? To get everyone moving in the same direction, that's where we face the problem, that the AFCFTA has not been adopted by any of the continent's big wigs as this is a project we're going to drive. There is no real South African push because Wamkele is running it. Like, oh, this is South African citizen running it. Let's push it. Nigeria itself hasn't pushed it. And if Nigeria and South Africa, Egypt to a certain extent, but mainly Nigeria and South Africa, do not adopt this project and give it, because economic integration is a political decision. And unless there is political will behind it, we're going to find ourselves worse and worse off in the world that is emerging with the direction in which the Trump administration is going. So that is my hope. My hope is that we will see sort of what happened with the AFCFTA when Paul Kagame was chair of the African Union. He was the driving force to moving that thing forward. And since then, we've never seen another African head of state take over that project and decide to drive it forward. But that is the piece that's missing right now.
Is it too big to ask, too much to ask for 54 countries to align? Maybe it's better that it's done on a regional level at ECOWAS or SADC or the East African Community, that maybe that is more manageable at a cluster of 4 to 6 countries?
Ultimately, yeah, we've got 8 regional economic communities. And the thing is, if they were functioning properly, then all we had to do was simply combine them and we have an AFCFTA. It's just that
That's
the
right.
regional economic communities themselves struggle with coordination. Now, it's much easier to coordinate 7 or 8 countries or 15 in the case of ECOWAS. Look, since 2013 in ECOWAS, we've traveled with the same passport. All of us carry the ECOWAS
Yeah.
passport, right? There's significant political integration happening there. It's been difficult to do it on the trade side. I think the East Africa community and SADC do better in terms of trade integration than we do in West Africa. So I think, though, and this is what I've been pushing in my very opinionated pieces that I've been doing, is that it seems to me that leadership on the continent doesn't recognize that the world has changed. And it continues to engage the world as if things are still the way they were like 5 or 10 years ago. In Europe, over the last 15 years, right-wing parties have won more votes than any other political movement. In
That's what I was saying, yeah.
Austria, there was a possibility where the Freedom Party, which has close ties to the former Nazi party, would have formed a government. Look at AfD's wins in Germany, right? And look
Giorgia
at
Meloni in Italy. I mean,
look at Le Pen in France. All across Europe, right-wing parties are winning. And what we're seeing in the United States is a rightward shift of American politics itself. And for some reason, it seems like our leadership on the continent doesn't recognize that in most instances, right-wing parties are nativist, they are isolationist, they don't so much, and there is a belief now among right-wing politicians and in right-wing politics in Europe that question the universality of some of the values that came out of 1945. To such an extent that the world that we have become accustomed to no longer exists. And that was my piece, that the world has changed. And so one hopes that, I keep harping on this, that we will become more, to Rasul's point, interest-driven in terms of how we do our politics, how we form our relationships. And when you negotiate with China, when you negotiate with Russia, the Chinese have no obligation to give you the best possible outcome at a deal. That's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is to the Chinese people. Africans have to look out for themselves. So I have a piece coming out today about how we can channel FOCAC promises, because the form in which it is now, very few African countries are going to be able to benefit from it. So please look out for it. It's coming out at the Center for Global Development. It's about channeling FOCAC commitments in a time of global turbulence.
By the time that this show is out, your piece will be out. We will put it in the show notes, and we're going to put your column on the post-American world. Cobus, I'm going to give you the last word because all of us have got to get out of here.
Yes.
China, the U.S., Africa, and the post-American world. What do you wrap this all up for us so we leave with something to think about?
Yes.
Yeah, easy question. I fully agree with Gyude that Africa has to really kind of put itself in the center of its own world. Like all its other relationships have to come second to that, and it has to then also, I think, acknowledge that one of the things that's happening here is a kind of a tectonic shift that has a lot to do with the West's position in the world, right? One of the kind of key barriers to for example could have a more closer collaboration between Europe and Africa is this resistance within Europe to acknowledge that they in Africa are together forever, and to acknowledge that they are part of the Asian continent, right? Kind of like that Europe, kind of is a peninsula, so that, there's a resistance to that, right? Kind of like that, and we, like, Africans should be aware of the kind of structural symbolic position that Africa has played in Western self-conception, right? Kind of in the way that Western countries thought of themselves as, used Africa as a symbolic kind of counterexample to define what they are not, right? Like that has been really fundamental to how Europe sees itself, and it's been really fundamental to how the United States sees itself. And so, so in that sense, one has to take a kind of a maybe cynical is the wrong word, but like a realistic view of the limitations of the appetite to work with Africa that is in Europe and that's in the Western world, because of certain set kind of fundamental issues about how the Western world sees itself. So in that sense, I think it makes a lot of sense to diversify partners, as Gyude was saying, to find different partners to do different things, and particularly to find those partners in other parts of the global south, and particularly along the Indian Ocean rim. I tend to think that, like finding 25 like Indian Ocean rim countries you can do different stuff with will end up kind of helping Africa maybe more than somehow finding some magical way of fixing its relationship with Europe that doesn't want to be associated with it, and with the US that, doesn't kind of enjoy thinking about it, right? So that, there I think there's certain amount of kind of pragmatic kind of moving forward to countries that share some of the stuff one is going through may be helpful.
Well, I as somebody who is a longtime resident here in Southeast Asia, think that the potential for Africa-ASEAN trade is huge and under-tapped, and I'd like to see more South African and African products on the store shelves in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam. 700 million people in this market, huge market, and growing. And so I think that is a huge opportunity. Gentlemen, thank you both for your insights today. We covered a lot of ground. Unfortunately, I have a feeling we're going to be back at this again tomorrow and the next day, trying to kind of put this all together and figure out what's happening. The changes that we're seeing now are historic in nature, on par with what we saw in 1989. The world, as Gyude said, is unrecognizable and will never go back to the way it was. So we all have to learn what this new world means for all of us. And so that is a challenge that we're undertaking here at CGSP. Gyude Moore, thank you so much for your time. Gyude is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington and an inaugural fellow at Global Neighbours. Really appreciate your insights, and we can't wait to have you back. And we're going to showcase all of your writing in our newsletters and on our social followings as well, because what you're writing is so important. So we appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here.
We'll be back. And so for those of you watching on YouTube, we'd love to have your comments. And for those listening at home on our podcast, thank you so much. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. For Cobus, Gyude, I'm Eric Olander. We'll talk to you again next time.